Hello, everybody. Welcome, Kevin Dennis with Work at Height. Thank you very much for registering and attending this webinar. It is titled Fall Protection Training. We are going to review fall protection training requirements and how to accomplish them. Please, as the presentation goes along, if you have any questions, type them into the chat. I'll be monitoring those as the presentation goes along. I'll also be opening up the phone lines at the end of the session to answer any questions the group may have. I encourage everybody to check out the website, wawmember.com. There under the upcoming events tab, you can also register for future webinars, training events, as well as take a look at other consulting and training services that Work at Height may be able to provide. So at that, let's get underway. All right, whenever I start having the training discussion with people, I like to start with why are we doing this? Why is an organization going to take the time and spend the money to conduct fall protection training or any safety training for that reason? So fall protection training has got several objectives, and I prefer to kind of put all of those objectives into one of two categories. The first category is the moral or the safety objectives. We're conducting training to increase the skill and knowledge of the people on site. We are conducting fall protection training to improve that employee's value. They may want to take training to achieve some type of certification or to understand their equipment better. But one of the objectives of training is the investment in the people. We conduct training because we want to either prevent an accident or reduce the severity of an accident, so we don't have the human suffering occurring, when somebody is injured or disabled due to the causes of a fall. So accident reduction and prevention is obviously one of the main objectives of conducting training. We conduct training to have people understanding how to use the equipment. If they're being issued a harness, SRL, lanyard, horizontal lifeline, whatever it is, we want to have them understanding how that piece of equipment works and have the confidence that they're using it correctly. We conduct training to improve or maintain a culture of safety at the workplace, to improve morale. And then people understand that it's the right thing to do. If an employer has people that are exposed to fall hazards, even in the absence of any occupational health and safety regulations, they go, the right thing to do for that person is to train them how to protect themselves. So these are all the moral or the safety objectives. The next list are the legal or the business objectives. This is the list that nobody really wants to talk about. However, they're just as valuable as the safety reasons, as we still have to accomplish these objectives when we're conducting fall protection training. So these objectives include compliance. There are occupational health and safety laws that say if you have workers up at height, you must train them in fall protection systems use. So adherence to a law is obviously one of the objectives of the training. Okay. Second is also to reduce lawsuit potential. If there is an accident, we want to, as the employing organization, demonstrate that we were duly diligent. We met the letter of the law. We did what was right for that person. We were duly diligent in providing training for that person. And obviously, if we do a good enough job of the training, hopefully we prevent that accident and we are never in that liability situation. But that is one of the objectives, is to prove that the employer has done the right thing. We may be conducting training to increase productivity. If we're losing time or money or people due to a lack of training, that's going to cost an organization in the long run. Along the same lines, there may be contract or insurance obligations that we have to conduct training in a certain way or a certain length or a certain content to get certain jobs or to get certain insurance policies or maintain those policies. And also one of the objectives of training is to document it. We have to be able to prove what training was conducted for all of the people. So there's all of these training objectives. And the reason I explain it in this way of the safety reasons and the legal reasons is every training event, every single thing that we do during training should be feeding one of these objectives. So let's take a look now as to how we accomplish this. So every training event has certain elements. There's consistent themes or consistent interactions that attendees in a training event will have with either an instructor or however that training event is being organized. And I prefer using the word training event, as there's a misconception amongst some people that fall protection training has to be a separate course. And although a separate course is beneficial, there's an incredible amount of opportunities for an employer to have higher frequency but lower duration touches on fall protection. New hire orientation, toolbox talks, project planning. It could be a journeyman or an apprenticeship situation where you can interject fall protection training. So there's all kinds of opportunities. So rather than just saying training, I prefer to call it a training event. But however the training program is structured, all training events will have these, again, consistent elements. There's always going to be some type of presentation, whether that's computer-based presentation. It could be a webinar, not dissimilar to what we're doing right now. There's a lecture on a topic. People might be watching a video, but there's some type of presentation of the material. There may be a test at the end of it, whether that's Q&A, whether that's an online test, whether it's an actual written test, but there might be some type of written verification. People are handed instructions, might even be given a book. People participate in exercises, or they watch a product demonstration, or they're given the opportunity to ask questions and have discussions. So there's all of these elements, and all of these elements are feeding either the safety objectives or the legal objectives. You know, take, for example, signing a roster. Signing a roster does not do anything to improve somebody's value, knowledge, or skill, but it certainly feeds the documentation requirement as it's recording the training event. So out of all of these interactions that students will have, I would tell you that there's one of them that rise above all others in accomplishing both objectives, and that would be this one right here. Having people participate in exercises, you get the highest level of skill development, you get the highest level of retention, and you can also defend yourself that people put on a harness or interacted with a lanyard or a self-retracting lifeline, whatever the situation or application might be. There's an incredible benefit in having somebody participate in exercises. All right, and this isn't anything new. We know that people learn through our senses. Adults learn by seeing things, we learn by hearing things, and we learn by doing things. And the experiential exercises, that's where you get a higher level of retention, greater depth of understanding, and that's where you really start seeing a change of behavior. I always try to equate fall protection to automobiles because everybody understands automobiles. So think back when you were learning to drive a vehicle. You know, yes, you had to study the book. Yes, you took the test. But where did you actually learn how to drive the car? You know, it was there with your parent or the driver's ed instructor when you actually got to put some dedicated time behind the wheel. And that's where you really started to understand how to drive a car. So any training that involves a skill, putting on a harness, making connections, you know, interacting with descent control devices, tying knots, rigging, any skill development, it's really key that you include experiential exercise. It's insufficient just to show somebody something or tell somebody something without actually having them work with the content or the material. So training events that do not include experiential exercises, they're good for information, but not for skill development. So don't get me wrong. I support all training events, even if it's somebody clicking through a computer-based training, there's some benefit there, okay? But if you are looking to accomplish both of your training objectives of improving the safety of that site or individual or culture, as well as putting yourself in a defendable legal situation, making sure you're compliant, experiential exercises accomplish both of those objectives better than anything else. All right, so again, to summarize, training events that include experiential exercises accomplish a higher degree of knowledge and skill. They accomplish compliance when documented, as well as checking the rest of the boxes for compliance, and we're going to go through the OSHA requirements here in the next few slides. And they're readily defendable if challenged. So let's talk about an example. Pictured here is a water tank, let's say it's 60 feet up. And you can see there's a fixed ladder on the side of the tank, to which is a ladder climbing device or a cable running down the center of that ladder. So my training event whether it's a toolbox talk or new hire or separate class, or maybe it's a mentorship of on-the-job training, whatever the training event is, if that training event includes the person actually putting on and adjusting correctly the harness, or an example similar to the harness that's going to be used here, connection of that sleeve on and off the cable, how to put it on correctly, connecting to the harness, they climb up and down this ladder climbing device a couple of feet, and they simulate the procedure to get off the ladder climbing device at the top, there is no question in anybody's mind, in that employee's mind, the employee is probably going, hey, right on, now I know exactly how to use that device, go up that water tank and get off on the top. And then the employer and the organization is in a very defendable position because they can prove that every single piece of equipment and the procedure to do this safely was included in the training event. So exercises, exercises, exercises. I can't stress enough how much value there is in conducting experiential exercises with the training events. All right, so now I want to review the OSHA requirements, the OSHA, Washington, and Oregon OSHA requirements for fall protection training. I'm not going to go line by line and regurgitate or read what they all are, but I want to capture what are the minimum requirements for your fall protection training programs to accomplish. All right, so I'm going to start with the federal OSHA requirements. There's two specific fall protection training regulations in federal OSHA. There are ancillary ones in telecom and power generation and distribution, but the two main sources are 1926-503 for construction and 1910-30 for general industry. 1926-503 is Subpart M. It came out in 1995, and I would tell you that most all regulations, Oregon, Washington, OSHA General Industry, Army Corps of Engineers, they were all kind of born out of Subpart M because it was the first one to talk about, or first one to include requirements for fall protection training. So to summarize them briefly, 1926-503A requires that fall protection training is provided to each employee who might be exposed to a fall hazard. Makes perfect sense. They're trained by a competent person. So whoever's conducting the training has to have the ability to train. Okay, so some adult education elements, or at least some knowledge of the topic, and the authority. We know that the competent person definition is ability and authority. The scope of work is training. So that competent person delivering training has to have the ability to train and the authority. Okay. Training has to include the procedures of to erect, inspect, maintain, assemble all fall protection systems used. There has to be a written certification record that includes the details of the training, names, dates, employer signatory, or if you're relying on previous training from a different employer or a different source, you have to include the validation date, or what date you validated that previous training actually works. So there has to be this written certification record. And then there's a section here under retraining, 503C. And this is a topic that kind of warrants some discussion. Is a lot of people always ask is how long is training good for? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Everybody thinks that there's some type of expiry date, just like first aid or CPR. And there isn't from an OSHA point of view. Okay? If you take training from a third party where you take a specific class, there is usually some type of retraining requirement. Okay? Because that training organization, either for business reasons wants to have that person come back, or just for maintenance of education reasons want to make sure that person comes back. But there isn't, at least from OSHA's point of view, or Washington or Oregon, a requirement to retrain people on every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. Okay? It might be a self-imposed requirement, but it isn't an OSHA requirement. OSHA only requires retraining when an employee doesn't understand or demonstrates that they don't have the skill required. So after training, if somebody isn't wearing their harness correctly, the training didn't take. They didn't understand the training, or they're refusing. Who knows whether it's a disciplinary or an insubordination situation, or they just don't understand. But somebody not understanding or demonstrating the skill required is a reason to conduct training again. Or the workplace or the equipment changes that renders previous training obsolete. I often get the question of a company goes, I've bought manufacturer's A harness and now I'm moving to manufacturer's B harness, do I need to retrain them on the new manufacturer's harness? And the answer is generally no. You wouldn't go through a different driver's license when you change from a Ford vehicle to a General Motors vehicle. The changes aren't significant enough to render the previous training obsolete. But let's say I go from a self-retracting lifeline protecting a ladder to a ladder climbing device. Those are different systems. You connect to them differently. You inspect them differently. That change in the workplace or change of equipment is enough to trigger a retraining requirement. So retraining is only required in 3 situations. And that's when the employee doesn't have the requisite skill. Retraining has to occur with the workplace changes or the equipment changes that render previous training obsolete. So these requirements: train the person, select somebody qualified to do the training, include all the procedures to erect, maintain, and disassemble, document the training, and retrain are very consistent themes amongst all the regulations. So moving over to general industry requirements, they're all the same. They're very similar. Each employee gets somebody who's qualified to be able to do training, include the procedures of all the equipment. Employer must train a person. This date now, it's 6 years ago, so it's kind of irrelevant for our purposes today. But when Subpart D came out, there was a drop dead date to where you had to conduct training by. Retraining requirement is the same, but general industry included this, which is kind of interesting. Is training must be provided. So the information, the academic, and then the exercises, the actual training, in a manner that the employee understands. So if there are language barriers, there's learning barriers, the training has to be delivered in such a manner that the trainee or the employee understands it. And this is another reason to conduct experiential exercises, is regardless of the medium that you use to train that person, if they demonstrate it back to you correctly, that medium was successful. Okay? So if you have a proficiency check or an observation of performance to where that student actually, using our water tank idea again, if at the conclusion of the training there's an exercise where they have to put the harness on, interact with the ladder climbing device, go up and down and simulate the procedure getting off the water tank, that employee understood your training. Whether it was a video, whether it was a lecture, that's kind of your litmus test, whether your training was successful or not, is if the person demonstrated the exercise back to you. So that's another plug for conducting experiential exercises. It's actually a check on the quality of the instruction or the quality of the training event when that person successfully conducts whatever the topic is. So that's a requirement that you're seeing in federal general industry, and you'll actually see it in a couple of different places here as well. All right, moving on to Washington State. Training requirements for fall protection can be found in the Unified Standards for Fall Protection, 296-880-10015, so 10,015. And it's very similar to the federal OSHA requirements with a little exception here. So the employer must provide training to each employee. Let me get my pen here. Provide each training to each employee exposed to fall hazards, recognize fall hazards and procedures to minimize those hazards. So that's pretty straightforward. Procedures for how to install, inspect, operate, and maintain any fall protection system. So that's our equipment list again. And this one here is the one that's unique to Washington. During training, as a result of training, employees must demonstrate understanding and ability to use fall protection properly before performing work. So it kind of reinforces what I've been saying in this presentation, is including that experiential exercise. You can kind of see the trend and what Washington State is trying to accomplish is training that doesn't have somebody demonstrating the understanding ability. You don't know if you were successful with that training event or not. Okay, so it's another plug for exercises. As at least in Washington State, part of the training is the student must demonstrate understanding. The easiest way to do that is to have them repeat that equipment use and the procedure, as part of the training event. Washington State also has the same 3 retraining requirements. insufficient skill or changes in the workplace or equipment. And then it also has to be documented with names, dates, subjects of training, and the signatory of the employer. All right, and then taking a look at Oregon, Oregon OSHA wrote specific requirements for construction. They're very similar to Subpart M 1926-503, but they can be found in 437-003, 0503, also in Subpart M. The general industry requirements for Oregon are the same as 1910-30. So I only included the 503 section here in this presentation. But they're very similar. Provide training to each employee exposed to recognize and minimize fall hazards. Trained by a competent person qualified to deliver applicable training. So again, it's whoever you're selecting to do the training, make sure they have the ability and the authority and experience to do so. Fall protection training has to include procedures to recognize hazards. And then when you look at your equipment, for each piece of equipment that person is issued or has exposure to, they have to know how to inspect it, install it, operate it, maintain it, and disassemble it. Okay. Training has to be documented with a written certification record that again includes names, dates, signatory, and the validation date of previous training if that's being relied upon. And then the retraining has those same three elements. It's not based on time, but insufficiencies in employee skill, workplace or equipment changes that render previous training obsolete is your trigger for retraining. All right, so then the next thing people always ask is, how do I accomplish that? And I'm a big supporter of conducting a quick needs assessment. It doesn't need to be complicated. What you can do is you can identify all the equipment and systems being used on site, reach out to purchasing and say, hey, send me a list of all the fall protection equipment you've purchased in the last 2 years. That's a good starting point, is to give you an idea of what's on site. And by having that equipment list, what are all the anchorage connectors, SRLs, systems, harnesses, that automatically kind of populates the content of your training events. Okay? So that's stage number one, is what are all of the equipment and systems available on site. And then obviously the training has to include how to inspect, assemble, use, disassemble each system, and a experiential exercise for each product. And then you can also, part of the assessment is you need to look at all of the practices. And for lack of a better term, practices usually isn't a hard skill like putting on a harness. It might be more on the academic side of determining clearances, identifying acceptable or unacceptable anchorages in regards to strength or location, clearance estimates, connector compatibility, how to transition from one system to the next. And you can do this pretty easily by just looking at the nature of somebody's work, following the path of the worker and going, okay, here's the practices that this person needs to know or understand, as well as all of the equipment use elements. All right, so let's put this into practice a little bit. Conducting a needs assessment, you just look at the work, follow the path of the worker, document and keep track of all of the equipment that they are exposed to or expected to use, and then any of the practices that they're expected to use. So in this situation, it's a rail car loading and unloading area. A rail car comes up, is docked, worker goes up onto the ladder here and onto the platform, goes over to the rail car and makes the connections to load and unload material into the tanks. So looking at this work application, the only equipment the person is actually going to be exposed to is the use of the harness, okay, the donning, adjusting, and fit of it, and then how to connect the harness to the SRL. Everything else is already done already. This person isn't selecting anchorages. They don't have to estimate clearances. They don't have to pick which piece of equipment to use. So the training for this person is really minimal, as all of that all of those elements other than the harness and interacting with the SRL is already established for them. So a training event for this person is really just put the harness on, adjust it, and don it to fit. Before use inspection for function and condition of the harness and the SRL, and then connecting it to the harness. And then the practices, really, we just want to make sure that they understand the principle of 100% protection, is they need to be connected to that SRL before that walkway is laid down. Okay, so this example is really straightforward, but I think you can see how simple a needs assessment can be. Is again, you just document the equipment they use, and then take a look at the practices that they're also expected to use. All right, another example would be a roofer system on a residential construction site. following the path of the worker and documenting all of the equipment that they're going to be exposed to. First of all, if they are installing their own anchor, there's going to be the anchorage connector, whether that's a nail down, lag down, pass through, however that anchorage is going to be installed. If they are installing it, there should be an experiential exercise during training, even if it's simulated on the ground with a couple of chunks of wood, how to install that anchorage connector. All too often, you'll see pictures of this and somebody goes, oh, you nail it down, and then they move on, and they don't understand that, especially with roofing anchors, going through the sheeting and connecting to the truss member underneath it, that's the only way you get your strength out of these anchors, and using all of the fasteners required. So by conducting an experiential exercise, not only does the person understand how to do it correctly, but they just as importantly understand when something isn't correct. We have all seen examples of this exact system. Very rarely is it 100% correct, at least the anchor, just due to the number of fasteners, the location of fasteners, or the direction of loading. So again, I can't preach enough about how valuable experiential exercises are, not only again for how they do it correctly, but also identifying when something isn't correct. So if that person is actually installing their own anchor, the training should include that content and the exercise demonstrating that skill. Then there's the harness, donning, adjusting of it, then the lifeline, connecting it to the anchor, and then how to adjust it for travel restraint and arrest. So that's my equipment list. Again, it populates the content of our training event. And then what are the practices? Okay, especially for residential construction, the person needs to understand the practice of travel restraint versus fall arrest. None of these systems are 100% restraint, because there's always gable ends, corners, where sometimes the system is being used in fall arrest. So it's important that the user understands how to adjust that grab, when to move the system, when a restraint system is no longer a restraint system. So that's one of the practices. If they are setting their own anchor and determining where that anchor goes, and they're making the layout plan for the roof, they need to be able to estimate clearances. Okay? They need to be able to say, once I have a offset with this vertical lifeline and due to swing fall, this is the zone where I need to move my anchor. Okay? And they may have to understand the principle of first on, last off, or first person up principle. As there are exceptions in most construction regulations for people to get onto the roof of a house to install the anchor without any fall protection, providing that is done before any of the work begins, and then the same principle is getting off. So it's kind of the first person on, last person off principle. So this is another example of how the hazard assessment, looking at the equipment and what are the practices expected of that person, populates the content of your training event. All right, and one more example to kind of wrap it up in conclusion. I think everybody sees what we're going for here is take a few minutes, identify the equipment that people are using, identify the practices that are expected of them, and that generates the training event content. All right, so a person up in a boom lift, mobile elevated work platform, aerial lift, several different names. The equipment they're going to be using is really just the harness and the lanyard. As the anchor is selected for them, it's identified by the manufacturer. They don't have to exercise any judgment in regards to clearances or anchorage selection, as all of that is done for them. So the training event is really going to be limited to, the donning and wearing of the harness and where to connect the lanyard, or SRL if that's the piece of equipment that's being used, and how to adjust it short as possible. If the work has them getting out of the lift, then you would have to include the practices of 100% fall protection. Is how do I connect off to adjacent structure before I get out of the lift, or how do I dock the lift in such a manner that once I disconnect, I'm immediately protected going into another system, or I'm stepping off of the lift, we're in an area where there isn't a fall hazard. So again, you can generate, the training content pretty easily by looking at the physical equipment and then identifying the practices. All right, we're nearing the end here. To summarize it, I think everybody can see what we're looking for here when it comes to training is to meet or satisfy your safety objectives as well as your legal objectives. take the time to identify all the equipment and practices employees are expected to use and understand. And no matter what format or training medium or training event you're using, whether it's new hire orientation, standalone class, third party, buddy systems, toolbox talks, all of those training events include experiential exercises. Okay, exercises. That's what really elevates the training experience from a safety point of view, and it really bolsters your position from a compliance and legal point of view. And then document all the training events. Document it all, even if it is a quick toolbox talk or a skills verification or a rescue drill. Document that, as there's good value in showing all of the training opportunities that people have within your organization. So thank you very much. I will open the floor to questions right now and go through the chat.